Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Christensen from Mount Royal University Library. Welcome to part 4 of this video series on the research process. In the last video, we conducted some literature searching using the academic database SportDiscus. In this video, we're going to be identifying our research gap, so that's step 3 of the research process, and using that research gap to develop a draft PICO question. So after I conducted my searches, I pulled out a few interesting articles and I made some notes. And I made notes kind of all throughout my searches. So as I found an article, I put it aside. And once I had a body of literature to look at, I started taking notes on each of them. And through that note taking and summarization, I quickly discovered what I think might be a useful research gap, or at least an understudied area. So for instance, I did a Credo search for student physical health, and here's one of the articles that I found that was useful. And in this article, it defines what student health is. So it talks about lots of different kinds of students, not just undergraduate, it talks about all different levels of schooling. It outlines some of the physical and mental consequences of living an unhealthy lifestyle. And one of the interesting things is it notes that health in college settings is understudied. So right off the bat, it says that looking at the health of students in a college setting or a university setting is something that's not well studied. So right away, it's kind of alluding to a possible research gap. This article was particularly good because it cited several other academic sources, so something I could follow up with. One of the scholarly articles I found was in the International Journal of Exercise Science, which I believe is more of a graduate journal or student journal. And I found this in the SportDiscus database. Just to review what I did previously, I was doing some searches with keywords like undergraduate and physical health. So not an incredibly complicated search. And I took a quote from this article, which said that the purpose of this particular study was to calculate the total daily sedentary time for the undergraduate population. So how much time undergraduates spend sitting either in their free time or while doing homework or in class. The article concluded that students are more sedentary than the majority of white-collar jobs, just based on how much time is spent sitting down. And a particularly interesting point from this article was that it wasn't completely clear that the students who participated in this study understood the difference between what is considered sedentary activity and inactivity. Just one more example of another article that I found. This article happened to be a review article, in this case, a meta-analysis. So the article looked at a variety of different studies on the topic of college students and physical activity, and it summarized the findings of all of the literature that it looked at. So it's kind of a review of existing research and then came to some conclusions. That's what a meta-analysis is. The authors noted that college student physical activity, or PA, again, is not well studied. So at the time of this publication, which was 2010, this area of interest wasn't particularly well fleshed out. It also found, based on the existing literature, that students typically do not apply the physical activity concepts they learned in K-12 or grade school to college, meaning that taking gym class or some sort of physical fitness in high school didn't lead people to be more active during college. It noted that higher education doesn't do a particularly good job of health promotion on campus, meaning that health promotion, it's not entirely clear what kinds of interventions the university could take that are effective at promoting physical activity among college students. So again, I'm starting to see a bit of a trend here between these articles. The next step is to find a research gap. I've only shown a handful of articles that I've summarized for this presentation, but ideally you should have found 5, 10, or 15 articles before you've come to a conclusion on a research gap. I've also done some additional database searching beyond what I showed in the previous videos. I did additional searching in SportDiscus, so permutations on the search that I demonstrated. I also did some searching in Google Scholar for additional academic articles about undergraduate student health. So now that I've read a few of the articles from my searches, I'm starting to get an idea of where a potential research gap might be. So, for several of the studies that I examined, there seemed to be a couple of areas that were well researched under the umbrella of undergraduate physical health. The first is that there's several studies that look at undergraduate physical health activity levels, meaning that they measure how frequently students exercise or go to the gym or how sedentary they are. So that's an area that seems to be well studied. It also seems to be well studied the impact of physical activity on academic studies. This was particularly interesting if you looked at health databases as well as psychology databases to find out what the impact of less physical activity was on someone's academic success. That was quite interesting. However, there appear to be few studies that examine a couple other areas. The first being that undergraduates' understanding of sedentary versus inactive lifestyle. I wasn't able to find a lot of research on that. In fact, that was mentioned in one of the articles I found as a potential research gap, and it seems to be one. The other aspect is the long-term effectiveness of physical health education interventions. Actually, it doesn't have to be long-term. It could be, semester long. It would depend how you define that period. But it's not well understood what kind of interventions for promoting greater physical health on a college or university campus would be most effective. So if I think about the areas that have not a lot of research done, that bottom section, those might represent a possible research gap. So now that I have thought about a potential research gap, I'm going to go ahead and draft a PICO question. So this is one way of developing a research question. We're using the PICO method to break down our question. And the example draft question that I've come up with is, do university undergraduates report higher levels of physical activity after partaking in an educational session versus students who did not over a 4-month academic semester? Now, this is just a draft. I could probably make it more specific and rework it, but let's break down this question using the PICO method to figure out what I'm talking about. So PICO stands for Population Intervention Comparison or Control, Outcome, and then Time. So our population group are undergraduate students. So this is perfect for the institution that we're at. And we're interested in undergraduate students' physical health, very similar to my original search. Now, the intervention would be some sort of physical health education session combined with perhaps an exercise self-reporting. I'm just thinking outside the box of how I would measure that, but I want to intervene with some sort of health education session, and I want to compare that to students who have no health education intervention. So that would be my control group. And I want to see if there is an increase in undergraduates' physical activity if they're provided more information about, say, the benefits to their academic studies of doing more physical activity, whether it be playing a sport or going to the gym or doing push-ups at home or whatever. The outcome, ideally, is that I want to see an increase in consistent physical education self-reporting from the experimental group, meaning the people who've been given an educational intervention. Now, we don't always have to use time as a factor in a PICO question, but for this demonstration, because in the research gap that I identified, it seemed like there was less understanding of the long-term impacts of some sort of educational health intervention to students. So that's hard to define what long-term would be. For this example, I'm going to try a 4-month period, meaning that we're going to see how long this works over the course of an academic semester. And that might be a good test, because through an academic semester, there's periods where there's lots of projects due, or there's midterms and finals, final exams. So can they stick to, or are students more likely to stick to an educational routine if they're told its benefits through an educational session? Now, this is where I'm ending the research process for this video series. We've kind of worked through all of these. So we've looked through the topic of interest. We've talked about literature searching, identifying a research gap, and developing a draft PICO question, which is what I've just done. Now, the next steps are you want to refine that question. And once you refine that question, you want to find a method by which you can go study that question, meaning you choose a way that you're going to carry out the study. So if you want to find an appropriate method for a study, there's a couple of main ways to do that. The first is that you could look at the existing academic literature. So you could adopt some of the techniques or measures used in previous studies, and you could use that to replicate an existing study or use a similar kind of survey, but in a different context. So that's one way. The other way is that you could look at a methods reference work or a database. So you could search research methods handbooks, you could search for guides, or databases for an appropriate method. Sage Research Methods is a good database for research methods that you could try. So depending on what you have access to through the library guide and what's provided, you can use that to choose an appropriate method. The next thing to think about is refining your question. So you have to be prepared to revise your research questions several times. I say first, second, and third draft of your question, probably with guidance from your instructor, is the minimum, but you want to refine it so it's specific and clear and makes sense, and that when you gather the data, that you're actually answering the question that you developed. The one that I posed today was just a draft question, probably could use all sorts of work, but you want to revise that question as much as possible so it's very, very clear what it is you're trying to answer. So just to recap, if we can address the research gap by developing a novel research question and a study to answer that question, that's what we're doing when we're contributing to the body of knowledge. So this is something I outlined at the beginning of this video series. So in this case, the example was undergraduate student health. I think I've identified a research gap that isn't well studied. I'm going to put together a study to answer that question about undergraduate physical health. And that essentially is one brick or one piece of the puzzle under the umbrella topic that is undergraduate student health. So you can think about, if you go back to that analogy of the brick in the wall, we are basically taking one study or one brick and filling in the gaps on that wall. So our understanding about that whole topic is a lot more complete. And on that note, thank you very much for listening to this video series. Please contact me if you have any questions about your research. And until next time.